If you remember, when we started out about discussing about Android, I mentioned to you that Android applications can consist of 4 kinds of components. What are the 4 kinds of components? Activities. Activities are the ones that allow you to control and display things on the screen. We also service. Service is a method of doing work in the background. So that's the second kind that we saw. We saw broadcast receivers, right? Now, I haven't shown you an example of making use of broadcast receiver before, but this particular location example that you will see in the lab next week will include a broadcast receiver. Because what happens is when you near a particular station, the alert will be triggered, it will make a sound, and then it will pop up information through a broadcast receiver to notify the user about the fact that they have reached a particular point which they are looking for. So I demonstrate the use of broadcast receivers also through this particular application. So we saw 3 kinds. What is the 4th kind of component that an Android application could have? The 4th kind is called as a content provider. Content provider is a more general way that Android allows applications to make their content available for other applications to use. Content providers are more general than simple databases. If you create a database within your application, the database will be only accessible within your own application. Say, for example, I just created this database with stations and their latitude and longitude information. But that database is accessible only within my application because I am the only one who knows how to make use of it. But suppose I have a database in the background where I store a lot of information and I want it to be made available to other applications. Then I can make use of the content provider framework to enable data to be available to other applications. What are some examples of content providers that can be very useful in practice? One example would be, for example, on your device, you store a list of contacts. You have an address book on your device, right? What is an address book? Address book is nothing but a list of all the friends that you have and then their information. And in the device, how is it stored? It will be stored in the form of some form of a database, typically an SQLite database on your device. Now, if you want to make that information available for other applications, say for example, you are designing a phone application and you want your phone application to be able to access the contacts database that is already on the device, then Android allows the contact application developer to export, to make open the database that it is storing for other applications to use. And that is enabled by making use of the content providers or the content providers method of providing. So this allows you to store and retrieve data and make it available to all applications. And this is the only way you can share data with other applications. Okay. Now, within Android itself, there are some standard content providers already built into the Android framework, okay, which allow you to access information that are already on the device. Things like audio, video, images, personal contact information, and so on. So there are specific content providers that are already built into the Android framework. Indeed, one of the examples that you will see in the lab tomorrow will show you how to make use of a content provider. Okay? And I will actually demonstrate that example in a minute. So applications can create their own content providers to make their data public. So if you have an application where you're storing a lot of data in a database format and you want to make the data available to other applications to use, then you can make use of the content provider framework for making this data available to you. So this implements, what does the content provider provide? The content provider provides at a higher level a very nice interface that allows other applications to be able to query your application and retrieve data from your application. Sorry? No, it's like a database. So a content provider will also return cursors for you. So when you send a query to your content provider, the content provider will return a cursor for you with all the database information in there. The actual storage of the data within your application is up to the designer. Now, within your application, how you store the data is immaterial to the user from outside. You can store the data in the form of an SQLite database. You can store the data in the form of a flat file, if that is more comfortable for you to deal with, and so on. That is immaterial. But the interface that you define for other people to access the data that you're opening to them is clearly specified by this content provider framework. So it provides a clean separation between the application layer and the data layer. Okay? How the data is stored within your application need not be exposed to other people that want to access the data. By providing this content provider interface, you make it easy for other people to query your content provider and access the data. Now, how do you access the data? When applications need to access the data that is provided by a content provider, they make use of something called a content resolver instance. Okay? Remember, one of the early slides I showed you that you can trigger activities, you can trigger broadcast receivers, and you can trigger services by using the intent framework. But when you need to access a content provider, you make use of the content resolver. So content resolver is like an object that allows you to access a content provider. So the content resolver, what does it allow you to do? It allows you to query, insert, and delete and update items that are provided by the content provider. So for example, if you want to access content provided by a content provider, I will show you, for example, how to access content that is stored in your device for contacts information. You would get hold of a content resolver object, straightforward in Java, get hold of content resolver object, and then you would query, for example, a content provider. That is a content provider that is available for you, and then you would do a query of the content provider by doing something like this. Okay? And you can fetch the content values. You already know what content values is, right? Content values is the object that allows you to insert items into the database. It's the same thing that you make use of even with content providers. So if you get hold of a content resolver, you can do insert and delete, all this kind of thing. So this is exactly like how you deal with a database, except that this provides a nice upper level interface. The content provider provides you with an upper level interface. Inside how the data is stored is immaterial, because you are exporting a database-like interface to other users through using your content provider. So content providers expose their data as a simple table, just like a database model. So they are making use of the standard tables structure of a database model. So each row is a record and each column is the data for a particular type and meaning. Now how do you know what the rows contain? That is defined by the content provider. The person who develops the content provider tells you, saying, if you do a query from me and then I am returning a cursor to you, my cursor will have rows and each row will contain all these columns. So you know that when you query a content provider and it returns a cursor, you know what exactly is contained in every row within the cursor.
But
yeah, sorry.
What if just right after you send the cursor information to some activity you want to use the database, you update the database. Yeah, you send it again.
No. Once somebody issues a query to your content provider, you access your content and then you reply, and that's it. Once that is done, it is done. You reply with whatever is contained in your database at that moment. Right? Obviously, that has to be done in a mutually exclusive manner. So, a subsequent update to the database, you cannot return that again. I mean, if you have a database, or if you have something that the content provider is managing, and there is an update to a content value there, you can't push that content value to other people. When somebody queries you, you return what is the current value there. But subsequently, if there is an update, so be it. There is an update. There is nothing much you can do about it. Okay? Yeah,
so
sorry.
The content provider writer has to give documentation.
Yes.
So
they need to specify how the content provider is dealing with this information.
Then they expose their code as well.
No, they won't be exposing the code. The content provider has a standard way of specifying, if you could do a query, what am I returning to you? So it will specify saying, if I return rows to you, my rows will contain this. That's all. It doesn't tell you inside how it stores this information. It doesn't even. So inside, if you don't like using SQLite database, you could simply store it as 3 columns in a simple flat file. It doesn't matter. When you write the code to read in from the flat file and supply this information to the outside user, then you should implement the appropriate methods inside your content provider. Content provider component that you create. So that's the thing. That's what I want to make it clear. The content provider does not immediately imply that it is going to store the data in the form of a database. Although storing in the form of a database makes it very convenient. So the content provider, if you are storing it in the form of an SQLite database, all these methods that you are doing here would be wrapper methods around the database wrappers, around the database methods that are already available. Makes it more easy. But there is no restriction that it should be. Okay? Now, queries return, as I said, queries return cursor objects. And since you already know how to deal with cursor objects from looking at how we deal with databases, it's the same procedure. It's the same procedure that you will use. So every content provider exposes a public URI, Uniform Resource Interface, Uniform Resource Indicator, that uniquely identifies its data set. So for example, a single content provider can provide 4 different URIs if it wants. If you do a query using one particular URI, it may return only some part of the data that it stores. If you use a different URI, it may return some other part of the data that it stores. So for example, a content provider that stores addresses of all the people, like contact information for all the people, it might expose one URI that will only return the name of the person and the phone number of the person. That may be sufficient enough for a phone application. On the other hand, if you are using a maps application that wants to query and then pinpoint the location of the user on a map, you may want the address of the user. You don't need the phone number of the user. It doesn't help you to identify where the user's location is. And so on. So, but then the content provider itself will manage the entire contact information for the user, and it can expose different interfaces, URIs, through which it will provide different pieces of information as required by the user. So that's one more advantage of doing a content provider. Okay? But for your particular course, I would suggest don't venture in that direction unless you really have to. Okay? For your applications, I don't think you really need content providers. But subsequently, if you work in this field, then you may need, your boss may expect you to know something about it. That's why I'm telling you about this, the existence of this. The second reason why I introduce content providers is there are some built-in content providers in Android. If you want to make use of the information that they are already exposed, you need to know how to query them and get information from them. So that's the second reason why I'm talking about content providers. Implementing itself, as I told you, I don't have an example to you to show you how to implement content providers. That I think is a little bit advanced for you. So for the moment, don't worry about that aspect. So for querying, you need three pieces of information to query a content provider: the URI that identifies the provider, the names of the data fields that you want to receive, the data types for those fields that you want to receive. Because if you do a query, you need to know what is being returned in those fields. As an example, if you are querying a particular record, you need the ID for that. So you could say URI to produce the base URI contact with ID number 23, and then you can use, for example, with something like this. These are all different ways that you can query this particular thing. My person is a URI that is being provided, and different ways of accessing these. Okay. This is where I show you a little bit of code in order to show you how to access the database. And again, as I told you, I have an example where I illustrate the use of this. And so let me go to that example and show you how to make use of these in practice. In this particular example, if you all recall, we saw this music player that you saw earlier in one of the previous labs. In the music player that you saw at that point, you saw that we were able to play back one single file, and that file had been included in the application. And that is obviously not a very useful music player, right? So what you want is an application that will find out all the music files that are there on your device and then provide you access to those music files so that you can play those music files within your application and so on. So what I have done is I have created this music player example. Let me see. So in this music player example, this is a simple example that I've created. What it does is it lists all the music files that I have on my device so that I can play back those music files. So for example, this is one of the audio files, MP3 files that I have on my device. Now, if I don't like that song, I can go back to my list. I can listen to a different song. Now, how do I get a list? This particular thing, you have seen this already before, right? This is the basic music player. I have jigged this basic music player to run it off of another activity. So this is the basic music player activity that you have seen before, except that when I call this, I am calling it from another activity which provides me with a list of all the songs that are there on my device. How do I make this list? How do I make this list? So as you realize, this looks like a list view, right? This is nothing but a list view. All I need is to supply these items to this list view. Where am I going to go and grab this information to supply to this list view? What I make use of is something called a media store content provider that is already built into Android. And then I make use of that in order to retrieve this information and show this information on the screen. Now, how does this work in practice? If you go back to the music player example, as we will see, you will see this example in the lab next week. In this example, what we are doing is this particular basic music player example is a slightly modified version of the example that you have already seen. Minor modification to it, that's all. But it exactly is the same music player. But to drive this, I make use of this other activity called as music activity, which gets its information by using a content provider. How does this work in practice? So this one, it initializes the music grid or music list view in the table. Now, how am I doing this? For that, I am using this media store content provider that Android provides. What does this media store content provider do? This media store content provider is a content provider, obviously. If I query this content provider, it will give me the list of all the music files that are stored on the device. Okay? And this media player, this media store content provider periodically indexes all the music files on your device and then keeps this information ready for you to use. How does this content provider work in practice? Now, for this, I need to understand more about this media store content provider. Okay? So I need to read some documentation about this media store content provider. So this content provider, what I am doing is I am getting from here, I am getting a managed query. Now, in this particular case, when I access this content provider, I don't need to specifically make use of a content resolver because that is automatically handled by the Android framework itself. So all I need to do is to create this array here, which specifies all the pieces of information that I'm trying to retrieve, and then I can create something called the managed query, and then I say, query this particular content provider, okay, and then I supply this thing called external content URI, and then I supply this thing. What is this? This is this string here. So I am asking this media store content provider to return me with a cursor. Return me with a cursor. And what does this cursor contain? This cursor contains rows. Each row contains information from the content provider, which includes the name of the file, music file, the title of the music file, and the artist who is playing the music file. So if you go back to this particular example, as you see, I have the name of the file here, the artist being displayed on the screen. So I know what file I'm playing and the artist who has played this music file. Now, how does this information get retrieved? Remember that every MP3 file has information that can be stored inside the MP3 file. The media store content provider queries all the MP3 files that are there on your device and then retrieves all this and constructs a database inside which stores all this piece of information. So when I do a query of the media store, it will return me all this piece of information. So it will allow me to display these kind of things on the screen. So for example, on your phones, you have a music player which lists all the music files that are there on your device. Where does it construct all this information from? By doing a query to the media store or your library. So I get hold of this music cursor. This cursor basically tells me how many music files are there on my device. And then after that, I construct a list view. And then fit this information from this cursor into the list view, and then put it in there, and then I'm done. Okay? So that is how I am taking care of supplying this information. Now, this kind of things, like media store, there are several other content providers that are part of Android framework. So what is this? Contains metadata for all available media, both internal and external storage device for your Android framework. So that is how I get hold of it. And then I know that when I query it, I can supply saying I want all these pieces of information from the media store library. I'm saying return me with the name of the file, the title of the music file, and the artist who played the music file, and then also return me a pointer to the file, because when I click on that, I need to be able to play the music file. So I have to tell my music player saying, this is the file that I want you to play, and that information is supplied. So when I click on a particular item, what am I doing? I am getting hold of, I am going into the media store library, and then I am selecting the particular item that I am querying, and then from that I get hold of the name of the song and then the file name, and then I am supplying this information to my music player activity, saying, look, this is the file, I want you to play this file. And then when I do that, my music player activity is playing out the particular song. As you see, it is listing the information about the song here and then just playing out this song. Okay? Yeah. Yeah.
So in the previous activity, that only says the name of the song file.
Yes.
And the file.
Song name. What do I do here? In the song name, I take the artist and then I am extracting that.
But then above,
I'm constructing that string
from
myself.
the content provider, we take title.
Yes,
We
but
take
I'm
a lot of
ignoring
things.
them.
Oh,
I don't want it, so I'm just ignoring them.
okay.
Okay. But yeah, you can take the title of the song from there and then use it. In this particular example that I have, for the two MP3 files that I put on the device, I didn't put a title for them. So that's why I don't have it. So I only had the artist name in the MP3 file. So I just index them by using artist name. But you can do more. You can obviously, when you play music using your music players on your phones, you would see a lot more information being displayed on the screen, including like the amount of time the music file will play and things like that. Those things are retrieved by using this kind of thing. Now, one interesting thing that I haven't directly explained to you is this put extra, which I will explain to you briefly in the next class to show you how you can pass information from one activity to another activity. When you do an intent, when you send an intent, you can also pass some additional pieces of information from one activity to another activity. That is how you pass parameters from one activity to another activity. That's one way. And I'll explain that briefly in the next class, and then we'll move on to. But anyway, if you go to the lab tomorrow, you will get to see this example in more detail. All right? So, next class, I will wrap up a little bit about content provider, and we are moving on to location-based services and so on. Okay, that's it for today. I will see you on Friday.